Yep. Giddy up, saddle up, Steve.
Chinwag launches.
Saddle up, Chinwag launches. Boom, boom. She's on the high seas again. Launched into space.
It's great to see you as usual, my man.
How are you, Steve?
I'm doing well. I had some sort of chainsaw adventures yesterday in the old backyard.
What?
Which was kind of fun, yeah.
What happened?
I was chopping down a branch in my backyard that's like 25, 30 feet long, and it goes like horizontally across the backyard. And so I had to get up on a
That's huge.
on a rickety ladder, yeah, and use this chainsaw. And the ladder was like wobbling, and I'm chainsawing through
Jesus
the
Christ. Jesus Christ. You cut your arm off or something. What do you do with that? Do you cut it in sections? You cut it off in sections. You don't cut the whole thing off, do you?
No, you cut the whole thing off at right where it meets the tree trunk. And the tree's fine, everybody. Don't worry. I didn't kill the tree. It's doing well. And then when it's on the ground, you chop it up. Yeah. But it's been raining here for so long. It's really interesting. I'm up there and the chainsaw's halfway through and it's spraying a jet of water and sap and wood shavings into my face.
Wow. Because it's so soaked with water. Because it's just like, but what was wrong with the branch? Was the branch like not good? Was it?
Yeah, the branch was dying and it needed to be removed. And so the tree's going to be healthier, but it was still very much alive at that place where I was cutting. So
absolutely.
It was intense.
What kind of a tree was it? Is it?
I think it looks like a birch tree that's like shedding its bark, but I think it's called a river elm. I was asking my brother, and I'm not sure, but I think it might be some kind of river elm.
Birch trees are kind of the silvery white ones, aren't they?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I think our listeners can tell from my description and then update us.
This is one of those things that we were talking about. I think we've talked about, like, I wish I was good at chess and stuff like that. I wish I was one of these people that knew, like, the different trees, the different birds.
Yeah, me too.
The different, like, I don't know anything about any of that shit.
People know plants, every friggin' bush. Yeah.
The constellations, stuff like that. like I wish I knew some of this stuff. And I make these half-assed attempts to try to learn that stuff. And I never really get very far.
Yeah, how are you with the constellations? Can you look up and see, like,
I don't know.
Cassiopeia, this is...
Yeah, exactly. There's the serpent.
There's the Big Dipper. That's about it.
Yeah, that's about it. Yeah, I can do about the Big Dipper. I think I can do Orion, right? Is it Orion with the belts? I think I used to know more. I used to know Pegasus. Am I right? The Pegasus, I think, or something. And then there's
you can't see anything in New York. You've got too much light pollution.
That's true. That's part of it. And there's the one that's like a serpent or something. I can't remember what the fuck it's called. Maybe it's Cassie. I don't remember. But that's enough. I was thinking the other day, you know what? I need a hobby.
Yes.
I do. I need a hobby. I've had several people say to me recently, pick up a fucking hobby. Why don't you? You know, and it's like, and I've always wanted to, but my hobbies are completely impractical. Like you just said, I live in New York. I want to get a telescope. I can't see shit.
You can't see
I can't see shit out here. So I was like, okay, I'll get my telescope. And then what? I'm going to take trips to West Texas to go like sit out in the desert. I'm like, maybe.
Hey, when you get a good hobby, you got to commit to it, man. And that means travel, whatever it takes.
Yeah. And I'm like, all right.
I told you, make some puppets. Make puppets or make machines or something right there in your own house.
Oh, puppetry.
Dedicate a closet. Get into it.
Puppetry. Maybe I should pick up puppetry. I don't know. Puppetry seems kind of cool. Why not?
It is cool.
It is cool.
I'm working up to it.
Like what kind of puppets? You mean like hand puppets or?
Yeah, like people make like marionettes and shit that like automatons where you turn a dial and then like the arms move and like really it gets complex.
Sure. That's my hobby. I'm going to make automatons. I'm going to make like a chess
Forget
playing.
about acting, man.
I'm going to make a chess playing automaton. That's what I'm going to do. You know what? Did you ever go through a period of time when you were a kid with ventriloquism? I feel like a lot of like kids.
Yes, I had a doll.
Did you? What kind of a doll did you have? Do you remember?
He had like he had a bow tie and a little black suit, and like his head. He looked like Big Boy. His head was just this kind of plastic combed over.
Big Boy from Dick Tracy. Like, is that what you said? Big boy from taking
Yeah, Big Boy.
Was it Charlie McCarthy? Was it that guy?
It looked like Charlie McCarthy, but he
Am I reaching back? Charlie McCarthy. Who the fuck has talked about Charlie McCarthy in 75 years?
I'm with you, man.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, ventriloquism. I definitely went through a period of time of being like,
What did you have?
My brother had a ventriloquist dummy, which was the other famous one. It was Mortimer Snurd was the name of the. Remember Mortimer Snurd was
Yes,
the other. There was Charlie. This is a famous ventriloquist, Edgar Bergen, right?
Yeah, Edgar Bergen, exactly. Yeah.
And he had Charlie McCarthy and Mortimer Snurd were his two famous characters. Of course, he was a ventriloquist on radio.
This is for the young folks out there.
Yes, for the young folks out there, this is a famous ventriloquist on radio, which makes no fucking sense for a ventriloquist.
That makes no sense. I'd be great on radio.
And I remember the first time as a kid when I saw Edgar Bergen, he's completely moving his mouth. He's 100% moving his fucking mouth.
That's hilarious.
He's not even pretending to do anything. He's just openly moving his fucking mouth. He's not even a ventriloquist. It's crazy.
Yeah, the standards were lower on radio.
That's right. The standards were just generally lower back then. People were easily entertained.
Yeah, that's true.
Fuck it. Maybe I should pick up ventriloquism. Maybe that's what I should do. Maybe that should be my hobby.
Man, you could bring it back. You could really bring it back.
Do you think so?
Resuscitate.
I remember my brother's doll, his ventriloquist dummy. He used to hang it on the wall of his room. And I could see it from my room.
Oh, no.
And I could see this fucking thing hanging on the wall. And because he would hang it by the sort of string on the back of its neck that operated its jaw.
Its mouth was open.
Maybe that wasn't it. Yeah, its mouth was like, just hanging open in the most menacing possible way. It's like, holy fuck, that thing is scary.
Yeah, that's how you operated it. You reached in and there was a string.
I think
and
so.
As you pulled at it, open and closed the mouth. Yeah.
Yeah. But there it was hanging there just like,
Jesus.
Terrifying.
That's why you turned out the way you are.
You think so? It was my brother's Mortimer Snurd dummy hanging on his fucking wall. Jesus Christ.
Oh, my God.
Well, here we are.
Welcome to the Chinwag.
Essentially, we're on radio. I guess it's kind of, it's sort of radio, isn't it?
It's true. It's true. We're doing all kinds of ventriloquism here.
Yeah, boy. Desperately trying to fucking... and as such, since we are on radio... Would you help us out? Help us out on radio. Don't forget to rate us and review us on various
Yeah, we really enjoy the feedback we're getting, and please try to spread the word, the good news about the Chinwag and the fine topics that we're already into today.
Absolutely. If you got a friend who wants to sit and reminisce about Edgar Bergen and the early days of radio and ventriloquism,
this is the show.
Oh, this is the place, let me tell you.
Oh, man.
Steve, I can hear the numbers dropping. I can literally hear the numbers dropping.
No, this is big with Gen Z and the millennials.
Yeah.
They're going to be all over this.
You know what? It is interesting. The kids do pick up on these old-timey things, though, actually.
Google it.
It's interesting. Absolutely. They like to do preserves. They like to preserve peaches in their basement. They do the old school stuff, quilting and shit like that. So, they'll go back to this.
If you really want something that's like going to restore your sense of craft, then you want to get into ventriloquism and puppetry. Get off the internet.
That's right. Build a marionette in your own home and just put on a marionette theater in your, God almighty. And please, after this, send comments about what we're talking about right now. Yes. I really want to know what you think of the shit that's coming out of my mouth right now.
Yeah, rank and review us, please. Yeah,
rank and review and send letters and comments. It's always a good time. We love the letters. We got the chin bag, the wag bag.
We're reading all this stuff. It's really fun to read.
Yeah, it's good stuff. All right, moving on to serious stuff. We have a tremendous guest today. I'm a big fan of this gentleman's writing.
So am I.
Yeah, I think he's my favorite nonfiction writer.
He's got such a great voice. His writing is really fantastic.
Really amazing. There's real precision, but real imagination and thought. And I mean, it's just great. He's an award-winning staff writer at The New Yorker. He's an acclaimed author whose best-selling books include The Lost City of Z, great book. The Devil and Sherlock Holmes, which is one of my favorite collections of essays. So good. The Wager, most recently, I think. The White Darkness, and of course, Killers of the Flower Moon, which was adapted into the 10-time Oscar-nominated film directed by Martin Scorsese.
Yeah, incredible.
Every time I say his name, I have to say it like that. Martin Scorsese.
Is that required?
Martin Scorsese. Anyway, we're very happy. I've wanted to talk to this guy for a while. He was kind of an original thought of mine when we started doing the Chinwag.
Yeah, I stumbled on the Wager, and then I found that you had read another book by him, and then we started talking, and he's just, he's dynamite.
Yeah, so very, very awesome. Please welcome David Grann to the Chinwag.
Hello, David.
Hello, David.
Hello. So I have to give you a warning. I managed to just cut myself shaving for the show. So if I bleed out on the podcast.
Wow.
Oh, that'd be great. That's good for...
that's excellent. This is a first for us.
Good numbers.
That's good.
That's good pod material.
That's good stuff. Yeah, as much blood as we can possibly get.
All right, good.
Sure. No, absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you for doing this. I'm Paul. We met very briefly.
Yes, we did.
Under weird circumstances.
Under very weird circumstances that you're used to. I am not, but yes.
I have never been in a situation quite like that we were at a strange party. LeBron James was there and they were serving In-N-Out burgers, and you and I ran into each other, which was
awesome.
Nice.
Yeah, we sought refuge momentarily together.
Yes, we did. It was an oasis of sanity for a minute there. And we talked briefly about the 18th century British Navy for a second. Which has got to be the first time that's ever happened, anything like that.
Which is crazier.
Yeah. I'm not sure which is crazier. I'm not sure. Which one represents a breakdown of society more. Anyway, I'm a big fan, as I've said to you many times, so it's really a pleasure to have you here. I mean, I've really enjoyed reading your stuff over the years a lot.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and going back to those sort of essays in the Devil and Sherlock Holmes collected in that collection, they're just some of my favorite pieces of that kind of journalism, and just amazing.
Yeah, I had read your book, The Wager, just this last year. And then I was telling Paul, oh, this guy's amazing, and then he told me about the Sherlock book, which I then read and then proceeded to read a lot of your stuff. So also huge fan of your work.
Yeah. This is just a kind of random question to be starting with, but are you like a Sherlock Holmes fan? Are you a crime and detective?
Yeah, very much so. They were among the first story. I probably went from Hardy Boys to Sherlock Holmes. And when I was young, I read all that collection of Sherlock Holmes stories. And the funny thing is, when I was younger, the person I was most drawn to was Sherlock Holmes, because I was so bewildered, and he was the Superman of reason. He could figure everything out. He would just kind of look at you and he'd see a little mud and say, well, you killed them in the barn because I could. and there was something kind of fantastical about it. And then, of course, now as I've gotten older and wiser, I now completely identify with Watson and realize we're all just rumbling around trying to make Sherlock was a fairy tale Superman, but
yeah, it's kind of sad to realize that we're really all just Watson. It's really true. I know.
He is, though, he is like a fantasy about the triumph of reason. And I teach logic, and I bring him up all the time. But really, it's so out of the realm of how anybody solves crimes and how science works and everything. It's just, life is disappointing compared to Sherlock Holmes, I think.
Yeah. Although then you hear weird things like the police in Singapore use actually Sherlock Holmes's methods or something. You read things like that all the time. The last time I read them was right after 9/11. And I was like, I need something to feel
stable.
Just stable.
Make some order of the world.
Yeah. I was like, and that was an amazingly soothing thing to do.
Well, I'm glad you had that. When COVID hit, I was working on The Wager, and I was obviously confined. I kind of brought the archives to my office so I could do the research here. But I happened at that very moment when COVID struck, working on the section about scurvy. And it was like in that moment of utter panic. It was really the very first days of COVID where you literally didn't know. You'd say like, okay, there's a package at the door. Can I touch the package? Does it have to stay outside for 24 hours? Do I have to index it? Like,
wipe it down.
Right?
Oh yeah, no.
And then I was writing about the scurvy and the typhus, and they were all like walking around the shift going, smelling and what spreads it, and they didn't understand germs. So, it was the most I could ever identify with these 18th century individuals I ever wrote about. That was my pleasure of COVID.
Interesting. No, that's alarming. I was actually interested when I read the book. I thought scurvy was something that they knew about for longer than that. I actually thought, I didn't realize that it was discovered that late. I don't know why I thought it was something people got earlier.
They knew of it. They knew that scurvy, all the way going back to Magellan, described in their early accounts. They I don't think they described it then as scurvy, but this enigma of the sea was known. It had plagued seamen. It actually killed more seamen than tempests and all the other diseases
really?
And battles combined. Yeah, it was just a
amazing,
complete killer. But they didn't understand that it was a vitamin C deficiency. Mm-hmm. What was interesting, though, is when you really did the research, I didn't get into the book, but occasionally through scientific observation, through Sherlockian detection, shall we say, the captain would record that when his sailors went ashore and they ate fruit or vegetables, they seemed to get better. And so a couple of them had postulated this without fully understanding why. And a few captains had even said, well, let's bring some of these things on. But it was never institutionalized, the knowledge, and fade out. And so it should have been actually addressed earlier. There was flickers of knowledge, but it was never codified or went its way up the ranks. And so, it remained a killer for so long.
Interesting.
There was a correlation, but they didn't know what the causal mechanism was that connected them.
They didn't. And I will say my understanding of scurvy, it's always interesting when you do research, and I'm sure it's the same for both you and your line of work, but when you research something, sometimes you have some vague notion of something. I mean, I'm such an ignoramus. Like when I do research on my projects, I know nothing about them. I mean, you're an expert at logic. You've read books. You're a scholar. I'm the guy at the cocktail party where for 1 minute I can sound knowledgeable, and then it's like really shallow.
Okay, well,
I don't believe that.
You're both way ahead of me because I'm a fucking actor, and I can, I'm the low man on the totem pole here. I'm by definition I'm an idiot. So it's like I do what I can. Now speaking of scurvy, and sort of like a breakdown of reason and things like that. Let's talk about The Wager a bit and to talk about, which is a story of a mutiny, basically. And I was interested to hear something that you were interested already in mutinies. And I'm interested to hear you talk about that because I find them interesting too, but I'm interested to hear what you have to say about it.
Yeah, me too.
I may blame you for film, but for me, what made a mutiny interesting both in literature and in film, it always intrigued me because it's a very distinct form of rebellion. We think of rebellions, within the populace rising up against the government and the military putting down the rebellion. But what happens when you have an institution is an instrument of order and the rebellion takes place within it? And so to me, that was just a very intriguing thing. And the way it had been depicted historically, I think as a result, because it's a distinct form of rebellion, it's either seen as this kind of very extreme form of outlawness because it's the lawful instrument suddenly doing disorder, or there's some vague kind of notion of maybe there's a nobility to it. Maybe there's some circumstances that justify it, against oppressiveness. This isn't any sophisticated knowledge. This was just my general impressions. And so it had always kind of intrigued me in literature and the way it would kind of shift in depictions in literature and film. And so that was kind of the loose thing that kind of gravitated me to the subject.
Interesting. I've always been interested, I think for the same reasons. It seems like it's this very small enclosed world that goes kind of mad and you're sort of cut off from everything.
Pressure cooker.
Yeah. I mean, mutinies can happen anywhere really. I mean, they can happen on land and stuff. But I associate it with ships and with being sort of at sea, and you're cut off from everything. And men, just guys, sort of like in this sort of pressure cooker.
A lot of testosterone.
I had an interesting circumstance I had a teacher in high school. He was a history teacher who led a successful mutiny on a Navy ship in Vietnam in the 60s.
Jesus, that's amazing.
It's really interesting. It's not very well known. It's called the USS Vance was the name of the ship. And have you heard of it? Do you know it?
I actually have. I read about some of these mutinies that took place during the Vietnam era.
Which is interesting because you don't associate it with the modern era in some way. That's the other thing. You think, well, that can't possibly happen now. It must have been easier to do then when there was less, I don't know, obstacles in place. There was more of a kind of security, so you couldn't really do it. But this guy, this teacher of mine, led a mutiny on a ship called the USS Vance, which was a destroyer, a radar destroyer, and it was sort of it was in the Saigon River, I think. And the captain was named Marcus Aurelius Arnheiter, which you couldn't have a better name. You couldn't have a better name for a crazy captain than that. Like it's amazing. And he was crazy. He was nutty. He was very Captain Queeg-like. It was this sort of crazy level of like random sort of just, he was just nutty. And so they let him mutiny and they removed him from his captaincy, and the Navy removed him. And the interesting thing that I've always thought was interesting about this too is that Arnheiter, the captain, kept insisting on a court-martial, which they wouldn't give him. And he kept saying, but I want you to court-martial me, because he wanted to have his say.
Exonerate himself.
Yeah, and they wouldn't give him a court-martial. Part of the thinking being that it was like so many guys were guilty of the same shit that he was doing that they didn't want him airing anything like in a court-martial, but that they wouldn't give him a court-martial, so he never got a public airing, and he was just kind of removed. But it was a successful mutiny, of which I don't know that there have been many in American history. I don't know.
Well, and it's interesting, and I think that's a different mutiny than the one I was thinking of, and now I don't remember the details, but I remember when I was doing the early research and I was just reading vaguely about mutinies, there was one during the Vietnam War, and I'm trying to remember if it was a protest against the war or if it was civil rights. I'm trying to remember some of the details. It had a kind of social justice quality to it.
Uh-huh.
And another one that's kind of interesting about mutinies, though, is they are often suppressed, even when they're put down literally, or even if they succeed. There's something very threatening about a mutiny to the state. And so historically, it's really interesting the way mutinies get treated, because regimes don't really want to talk about them, because they're threatening. They're threatening to the state, to its institution, to its authority. It cuts to the very core. So
yeah, rebellion.
Even in Ukraine, when the wager come out, and I'm sure we'll talk about that, but that was another mutiny that they didn't want to talk about. They wanted to kind of make it go away. And that was so interesting, because here you had an imperial war, an invasion of Ukraine that was completely bungled from the start. There was going to be 2 days, glorious march to victory, goes completely awry. And then there is this eventually a mutiny of some sorts. And then I was reading the New York Times, and the New York Times was kind of saying something to the fact that, Putin and Russia didn't want to refer to it as a mutiny. And, the very term mutiny was again threatening. You see that throughout history, and, up to whatever, just, it was a year ago, whenever that mutiny was.
Yeah. Well, no, I think that's why, actually that's sort of why they didn't want to court-martial this guy, because I think it was exposing something that was too pernicious or something. They just were like, no, just get out of here. We don't even want to talk about this.
Make it go away.
Yeah, it's a fragile kind of power balance where the people in charge can easily be overrun by all these other people who have weapons. I mean, in the case that you're talking about, Paul, were weapons drawn in that Vietnam case?
I don't think there were ever weapons particularly drawn.
You better step down.
I think so. Yeah, I think so. And I think there was enough of a general sense of the population of the ship moving against this guy that he sort of stepped aside. I think everybody was on board with getting rid of Marcus Aurelius Arnheiter.
He basically had the strawberries at one point.
Pretty much. I mean, it was actually, the funny thing is it is very much like Captain Queeg. When you read about it, it sounds like that. I'm surprised nobody's approached me to play Marcus Aurelius Arnheiter. It seems like a pretty good role for me. But there's a lot of great characters in your story of this mutiny.
Also, some great names.
Yes.
Right? I mean, history, like I don't know if you could do this when you're like doing a film, right? Or fiction, because some of these names are so ridiculous or they're so Dickensian. I mean, Captain Cheap. I mean, get a better name, Captain Cheap, who was also plagued by debts. And
the deal with these guys is they were sort of on a secret mission. It's a British naval convoy, sort of, right?
Yeah, it was a British squadron. Yeah.
Fighting the Spanish in the War of Jenkins' Ear. Is that right? Is that what the...
Another thing, another footnote. The War of Jenkins' Ear is, and we could talk about that too. But
yeah, what is the origin of it being the War of Jenkins' Ear?
The War of Jenkins' Ear, which has a little bit of the whiff of we were talking about Vietnam, but it has some similarities in the sense that it was at that time Britain and Spain were in a rivalry over their empires, and Britain was the kind of emerging empire, wanted to break Spain's hold over Latin America, its colonial hold. And at one point, Spain had allegedly, a story circulated, boarded a British merchant ship, and Captain Robert Jenkins had been seized and his ear was cut off. And this was circulated to propagate the war over Jenkins' ear. And it was, they were said, an eye for an eye, an ear for an ear, and and all the propaganda. And it turns out that the incident probably did happen. There is some record of it happening, but it was very ginned up. It had happened many, many years earlier, and it had been completely forgotten. It hadn't really made much of noise at the time, but the imperialists who were jockeying for war seized on this story and spread it. So it had a little bit of that whiff of the Gulf of Tonkin with Vietnam War. Mm-hmm. And of course, it then had the craziest name of a war ever, the War over Jenkins' Ear.
And what period is this actually? So
1739. Yeah. Right. 1739 was when the war was declared, and the expedition sets off in 1740.
And this ship was originally part of just the trading expeditions to the east, but then it got bought by the Navy and then it was put to this purpose. Is that right?
Yeah, it was kind of the ugly duckling of the expedition. It was about 120. My memory's gone now. I think it was about 123, 124 feet. I actually have a model of it over here. I can.
Oh, nice.
Oh, cool.
That's awesome.
Wow.
That is an actual model of the wager. So I get
wow. Where did you get that? How'd you get a hold of that?
My wife got that for me, actually. She found that.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's amazing. So
is it an antique?
No, it's made, but it's a very exact replica, but it was made, somewhere, I think, within the last decade.
Amazing. So cool.
So in any case, about 123 feet had been remade from a merchant ship. And, even as the kind of ugly duckling, these ships were quite remarkable, as you could kind of glimpse over there, even in the model. All the warships had 3 masts, these men of war, as they were referred to. And they could fly. I mean, the Wager could fly as more than 12 sails. Some of the larger ships could fly as many as 18. I mean, could you imagine?
Wow.
These masts would go up about 100 feet. They were both these homes. And I think this is also one of the things we're talking about mutinies. What's also interesting about mutinies, particularly on a ship, because they are these confined floating civilizations where you have people living together side by side. So these ships are both homes and they're also both instruments of war. And, they eat and sleep by cannons. There were 250 on the Wager, which was packed, and you had people from all walks of life. I mean, that all male, but ages from as young as 8 to 9.
Amazing.
And the cook on the Wager was 80. This squadron was short of seamen, and it was another one of these typical wars where everybody in the public clamors for war, but nobody wants to fund it. And they don't want to pay taxes for it or anything. And so short of men. And so they would send around these press gangs to round up people. And that was another thing I just kind of had some vague notion about from my junior high class on the,
Well, right. You think about it, but then you think about the actual practice of it is insane.
It's not.
They're literally just grabbing other guys they know are sailors. Is it guys who are coming off of ships and they go, well, we'll just grab those guys and put them on our ship?
Anybody drunk? Just drunk?
Well, drunks, guys who go on shore and get drunk and then they press them, right?
People will put on disguises to try to escape. Yeah, they would just basically eye you to see if you had any telltale signs of a mariner. And so, mariners would often come off ships and they had certain kind of ways. They kind of walk bow-legged often because, they're standing on a deck. I mean, so they would they would literally eye you. Oh, we got a bow leg. It was a little like a cowboy. Oh, we got a bow-legged one. We got a seaman.
Right.
And then they would, and if you had the checkered shirt or a certain kind of cap, and then they would, and the craziest thing too is they would come up to you and they would eye your fingernails because tar was used on ships for everything. It was the way you kept everything water resistant. So you would put tar on your clothes, you put tar on the sails. It was kind of used, liberally on ships. So if you had the stains of tar, we got one, and they would basically seize you and in effect kidnap you. And was so, imagine this: some of these people had just come off a ship. Let's say you come off a ship on a 2-year trip from the Pacific, let's say, on a trading ship. You come into port, you're like, finally, I'm going to see my family, my dad, my mom, my kids, whoever it might be, my loved ones. And they're like, well, nope, you're going right back out.
They grab you and put you on a different ship.
Oh my God.
Yeah, it's insane.
It's amazing.
It's amazing. And they would put you in these kind of like floating prisons that they would hold you on, and they would bring you out the ship, and they would anchor the ships away from the coastline because most seamen in those days, no one ever has explained this riddle to me. I need to drill down with a British historian, but most seamen did not know how to swim. British seamen didn't know how to swim. Like,
really?
Yeah, very few of them could swim. So they would anchor them out the shore because if the ship was out the shore, there was no way for you to
You're screwed. There's no way to get off of it.
Because they were deserting left and right for this expedition before they went out. But the craziest thing on this expedition and why the seeds of destruction were planted at the very outset is they were still short of seamen. And for the whole expedition, there were 5 warships, including the Wager. They needed about 2,000 men. They were still short. And so they went to a retirement home. This is my next stage. There you are sitting in your retirement home. And
this basically is my retirement right now, David, is what we're doing right now.
They would come in. There was a retirement home, a pensioner home for soldiers and seamen.
Yeah.
And these men were in their 60s and 70s. They pulled 500 of them out. Many of them are described as missing an assortment of limbs. And some of them were so sick, they had to lift them on stretchers onto the ship. And, you develop a gallows humor about this because it's so dark, but it really was.
It's horrible.
Horrible.
Everyone knew when these men were being loaded on the ship, they're not going to survive. I mean, to survive a voyage like this.
That was the Chelsea Pensioners Hospital they took guys from, right?
That is correct. Yes.
I did a job once in London and I stayed in an apartment that was just down the road from the Chelsea Pensioners Hospital, which still exists. And it's this grand sort of building that I think was built in the Restoration period. It's sort of Charles II sort of period. And the guys it's still a veterans home, basically. And the guys will sit around on the lawn and they'll play bowls. They're kind of bowling a lot of the time. But a lot of times they still will have guys who must be sort of assigned they must have kind of more administrative duties there or something, but they're wearing scarlet coats and tricorner hats and stuff like that still, some of these guys. It's a crazy place. So they're sent out. They have all these old men and guys who don't want to be on the ship who they've pressed in.
So try to mold them into a band of brothers.
And is there any sense of different, because I know when you read like Herman Melville or Conrad and stuff, and that's a different sort of, it's not the Navy, it's sort of merchant marine or whaling ships, but there's a lot of different races too. Is that the case too in the British Navy at all? Because it's like a microcosm of the world sometimes in like Melville or Conrad.
Yeah, there were, on this expedition, there were free black seamen. And there's one free black seaman on the Wager. You had people from all economic backgrounds. So you would have aristocrats who would be the officers and dandies, and you would have paupers on the ship. You would have farmers. You would have a craftsman, a kind of middle-class craftsman. So you had all economics. And these ships did tend to take on an international cast, especially overseas, because they would sometimes they were always short of men were dying, so they would often collect other seamen in other ports. So they would often take on a kind of different nationalities and ethnicities as they went.
I'm fascinated by like the period that's like 100 years later, which is when Darwin goes on the Beagle, HMS Beagle, and they kind of go to the same region where the Wager was, which is like the Patagonia, the very bottom of South America. And my understanding originally was, well, Darwin was sort of invited on as a kind of naturalist, and Fitzroy was the captain. But then I learned later, I think it was Stephen Jay Gould was arguing that actually Darwin was just sort of brought on to be like the gentleman companion to Fitzroy, because he needed to have some like class difference, like in the upper chambers, he could converse with this guy who's of well-bred compared to the rest of the crew. It's just so on the wager, were these class divisions strenuously maintained, or was it just a kind of free-for-all?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A commander of a ship could really shape and dictate the way life was on a ship. I mean, class structure was always present. It was marked even by, real estate. The captain would have the biggest space, and then it would go down the line. And the commanders of the ship were almost in that period always from the aristocracy. That being said, the very nature of a warship forced people together. And so in some ways, the class structure was less strict than it may have been on land.
Yeah.
Because inevitably, for example, let's take John Byron, who's on the wager, who will go on to become the grandfather of Lord Byron. He's from the aristocracy. He's a midshipman. He's 16 years old on the wager. He's being trained to become an officer, but he has to do all the work. He's got to get his hands in the bucket, train you to how to operate a ship, and you end up working along regular seamen. And so because of the nature of a ship, there was probably more crossing of classes in a way in terms of labor than you might have had on land. In an emergency, the captain may do something. I mean, he may have to grab the sheets. And interestingly enough, some captains, though, were probably better at leading by example, working with the men. And then there were some who were more rigid. And then you see this kind of spread out through over time. I mean, you can even see that with the polar explorers from England, later with Scott, who was kind of more rigid in terms of class structure. And then you'd have someone like Shackleton, who would really mingle much more with the men.
Who's an Irishman, so there's maybe already some predisposition to not be, there's something. There's a guy who becomes a very significant character in the story who is presumably a kind of lower class guy who's the gunner, who's the chief gunner on the thing, and he proves himself to be somebody who has incredible sort of like leadership skills and stuff. That guy, what's his name on that?
John Bulkley, another Dickensian name, Bulkley.
Yeah, for the gunner.
Yeah, and it's so interesting about Bulkley. I mean, Bulkley is a fascinating individual. We don't know what he physically looked like because he didn't come from the aristocracy. We actually know what Byron looked like. It was a thing you did when you were a captain. You get some glorious picture made usually by some very famous painter of the day that hung over your den, and everyone could look at you in your uniform. Usually, often there'd be a battle depicted in the background. But Bulkley could never have afforded that. But he was very literate. He was a gunner, which is at that time on a ship required a lot of ability because munitions could blow up a whole ship. I mean, you would be carrying enough munitions, to blow up a small town, and you're on a floating wood ship. So the maintenance of that, it was extremely important. And he was very literate. He could write, and he could write well.
Yeah.
And in many ways, he's often depicted in many of the accounts as the most skilled seaman. And so he was someone who could rise, and he had risen. He had risen to gunner, but there was still a kind of ceiling. Like, there was the chance of a gunner ever becoming a captain of a warship was highly, highly unlikely. So he knew that at least on the ship, even though he might have been an instinctive leader and the most skilled seaman, he would never become a commander of his own ship.
This is something that just comes to mind because I was fascinated in reading when I read this in the book too. Speaking of sort of munitions blowing the ship up, I was kind of amazed at how fragile these ships were. That was something that really surprised me because I don't know. I had some notion that these things were hammered together and they were, good British workmanship and they'd last forever and but they really were quite delicate, which was surprising to me.
Yeah, to me too. I mean, they're incredibly sophisticated in so many ways. I mean, they're in many ways, the areas that would build these ships were the largest kind of manufacturing sites then in the world. They produced so many different elements that would go on a ship, from candles to gunnery to anchors. You had a 2-ton anchor, but they were made of wood.
Yeah.
And they didn't yet have copper bottoms. And so they were made of tough wood. The hulls were usually made of oak. It could take about as many as 4,000 trees to build one of these.
Crazy.
Wow.
I didn't quote this in the book, but at some point you have to hold back on these wonderful little details you find that you love, but you fear you might And I found a letter complaining of deforestation at that period.
Wow. In the 1700s. Wow.
Yeah, complaining that there wouldn't be any forest left if they kept sending so many trees off. And but yeah, they were very susceptible to storm and sea, and in particular these sea worms that would kind of burrow in and hollow out the ship. And so these ships would go on a voyage and they had to be almost virtually rebuilt after a 2-year, 3-year voyage.
Amazing.
And their lifespan was, maybe a little more than a decade, if they were well maintained, maybe 12 years, a shipwright estimated. But yes, if you did not constantly tend to them, they would sink, as some did, right at the port before they even set off. And what was amazing about this expedition is, they were in a great rush and haste to get off, but getting these ships manned and loaded and repaired was taking so long that the expedition was delayed about a year.
Wow.
I don't want to give away the whole book or anything, but I do want to mention that what happens is this delicate ship crashes. I think it's just on the other side of Cape Horn. Is that right? And then the rest of the book is this terrible pressure cooker of these guys trying to figure out what to do.
Yeah.
And creating a kind of almost like two sides that were kind of warring with each other. And I guess they're starving most of the time, aren't they? It's just misery.
Yeah, they survive. Many of them perish, but they go around Cape Horn. At Cape Horn, it's funny, the little details too. Again, we talked a little bit about scurvy. I had this very vague notion that scurvy just affected your gums. I had no idea that it affected your senses and that your cartilage came undone. And
Wow.
One seaman said it got into our brains and we went raving mad. It's about as good a quote as you come by. And then they had to get around Cape Horn. And again, I had some vague notion. Wow, those seas around Cape Horn, those are bad seas. But you don't really, at least I didn't have any understanding why. Then you kind of read about it. It's just really interesting. I mean, there's just these weird geographic freakish elements that make it that way. It's the one place on the globe where the sea circulates the globe uninterrupted, about 13 miles. It never gets blocked by land. So it just accumulates enormous force. And then it gets funneled into this shallowing passageway off the tip of South America and Antarctica. So suddenly you imagine the sea with all this force, the sea shallows and it funnels inward. And so you get these Cape Horn roller waves that can dwarf a 90-foot mast. You have the strongest currents there than anywhere. And you have winds that, often accelerate gale force up to even 200 miles per hour.
Crazy.
Jesus.
So they go around there and they get ripped apart. These ships get ripped apart. At one point, they can't fly their sails as they're coming around Cape Horn. One of the captains can't control the ship without the sails. So he orders his top men, which are usually they're younger people who would work the sails, to scurry up the mast. And they would climb the mast about 100 feet. But in this case, they don't want them to work the sails. They want them to cling with their bodies to the ropes, hanging on, and to use their bodies as sails because the sails kept blowing out.
Oh my God.
So they are literally using their bodies concave in a gale force storm. Here you imagine a 16-year-old, a 17-year-old just hanging. And the ship was rocking about 45 degrees to one side and 45 degrees to the other. So
Jesus.
Man.
I always say this, so whatever you feel about your own life, you'll feel better about it after.
It's true.
But yes, they do eventually, some of them do. So the Voyager gets through this. They lose many of their men, but they get to this island and about 146 of them survive. They get on the shore. There's Captain Cheap. There's John Bulkley, the gunner. And there's John Byron, the lovely midshipman who would become the grandfather, later the grandfather, Lord Byron. And yes, and there they are the island. They hope it may be their salvation. And of course, it turns out to be even worse. There's virtually no food on the island. They begin to starve. They try to create order, but they fracture into these two main warring camps, one led by Captain Cheap, who thinks they should be governed by the same rules that govern them on the ship. He wants to build an imperial outpost, right? Heroism, sacrifice, honor. And then you have John Bulkley, that instinctive leader who suddenly says, in this democracy of suffering, maybe we should have our own rules. Like we're in a state, he literally says things like we're in a state of nature, which I love the language because you pick up these philosophical phrases. He
Amazing.
also uses what does he say? I think if I remember correctly, it's like liberty and happiness. I think he uses phrases like in our Declaration.
Wow.
Ah, interesting.
Yeah, really interesting kind of philosophical. So there's this philosophical class structure.
Yeah.
Political structure, all playing out on the island. They're having these deep philosophical debates even while they're killing each other.
That's amazing.
But at that time, there is a lot of philosophical stuff in the air about like social contract and stuff, right? And even like Rousseau and stuff. And there's all this stuff about sort of back to nature and are we sort of animals, are we, and civilization. There's all of this debate going on at that time philosophically about what constitutes order and things like that, right?
Very much so. I mean, you even had earlier, what is the role of the king versus the parliament and the rising power of the parliament. So yes, all these things were in the air even before the American Revolution. And you see those debates playing out in their own little microcosm here on the island in this really interesting way.
One thing that really interests me, and we're sort of on the topic now, so I wanted to kind of drill down on it, is a lot of your writing is fascinated by obsessive people and obsession. And, you think of these characters, these captains, you think of the empire, you think of just these poor bastards who are just trying to get through it. But also like, you did this whole thing on the lost city of Z where this guy's looking for El Dorado. In some of your books, you've got this guy who's searching for the great, the giant squid. Like, it's a really interesting question. What people are driven to do these insanely, magisterial accomplishments, but also it's a kind of insanity.
Madness,
to it.
yeah.
Yeah, it's the Melville Conrad thing, yeah.
And there's high-minded, and then it disintegrates. And there's a lot of disintegrating high-minded shit that then just kind of turns mad a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, they're just right. And I don't really, I'd be curious on all your thoughts on this because, it's a thing I don't, even after writing about this, I don't always fully understand it. I mean, people get a seed in their head, it gets kind of planted and it metastasizes and grows. And it can have a certain nobility and it could inspire them to kind of greatness. And yet at a certain point, it can also turn to hubris and monomaniacal and self-destruction and even madness. And you see that play out in a lot of the people I have written about. Partly what draws me to it is it just makes really good copy. I mean, it's like, right? I mean, it's people doing crazy things are far more interesting than, let's say,
sober, normal things.
Yeah. So we make great copy, but yet there is something really deeply fascinating and a riddle about it. And I think it does always kind of hold a mirror up to ourselves, right? We all get some idea in our house, the idea in our head that we are sometimes tempted to pursue and that can consume us and consume our rationality. It's almost that fine line, even when we go back to Sherlock Holmes, like trying to make such sense of the order of the world. And yet it's not hard for that order to tilt into madness.
You quote at some point, there's a great Conrad quote that you have from The Secret Sharer about a person proving faithful to an ideal conception of themselves. So it's a lot of this imagination of yourself, of sort of like what I should be, how I should function in the world, how the world should treat me, how I should, these kind of grand conceptions of self that are really hard to maintain. And are kind of, and within yourself. And then you think of society of people like this, of everybody banding together and having grand ideals about empire or grand ideals about, and constructing these elaborate fantasies that just come apart so easily. That's the most shocking thing about it. It's like the ships. It's why I think I was so fascinated by how fragile the ships were. I'm like, all of this shit that we make is so fragile. The actual vehicles we make, the institutions we make, the sort of sense of the personalities we construct, it's all so fragile all the time.
And it's so interesting too, because especially in The Wager, but it is true in so many stories and just human natures, we tell ourselves stories, right?
Yes.
And we like to be the hero of our own story. It's the way we kind of get by. And so we're always, and we're trapped in our own stories. I mean,
yes.
that we are confined, for better or worse, from the moment we're born, and in our head with these narratives.
Well, yeah. And there's that. And also there's that great, I think it's Kurt Vonnegut has that great quote about be careful what you pretend you are, because you'll end up becoming it at a certain point. You'll be trapped by your own pretense, which oftentimes is reaction to something that you're, to your upbringing. You go, well, that's not me. This is me. I'm going to be this thing. And then,
But I thought, like, I agree. I think there is moments of like easy vulnerability where they fall apart, but it's a very inspiring story too. This is why I like these explorer stories, is because like I get upset and want to throw in the towel when like the mailman doesn't come on time or whatever. And these guys are like, they keep persevering even when they're crushed. They keep going. Some of them do. And that's amazing to me. And that's stoic kind of like, let's press on, lads, kind of thing.
Onward.
Yeah, onward.
Yeah, onward. Yeah, and there's a level of resilience. And, you really see it in someone like Bulkley. I mean, he just had a will, a survival will, and a stoicism, I think also buttressed by a deep faith. I mean, he had a religious faith that propels him onward where many others are succumbing, and it's partly why others gravitate toward him. And then, but so many of them do emerge. But it's interesting. So many of them are trying to live up to this self-conception, and to me, that's why even someone like Captain Cheap, who in some ways is probably, at least to some readers, the lesser appealing of the three. And yet I always had a sort of perverse sympathy for him because, here he was, all he ever wanted to be was captain. He had this vision of glory for himself, that he would somehow triumph at sea and put behind him all the failures on land. And here he finally gets to become captain. So it's like his grail. He finally gets it at the wager, and then everything goes to hell.
That poor guy.
And his desperation to maintain that image in many ways is what does destroy him.
Right.
Yeah.
He's so insecure. He's so determined to hold on to it at any cost that it hinders him.
He can't adapt. Yeah, he can't adapt.
Yeah, he cannot adapt.
No.
But I had this weird sympathy. I mean, right? We all, have that.
Yeah, no, we do. No. But it's always hard to be sympathetic with the guy in charge.
Yes. And also when he shoots you in the head too, that's never.
Then he kills a guy. He kills a guy.
Always a problem as well.
Well, he kills a guy. He kills a guy because he kind of freaks out and he's worried that, he's like, he can't handle it. And it's like, and he's in charge and he sort of loses his cool and he kills a guy. And that becomes a real problem for him later when they get back to England.
And the other thing it kind of raises too, which we never really want to think about our own lives, because we also always like to think that we're so determinative of our own fate, I think in at least our day and age. And yet someone like Captain Cheap on another ship, on another expedition, in another set of circumstances.
Could have been fine.
Would have been totally fine. But that's a killing way. That just kills you to start to think of like, what if? What if? But there's an interesting thing that goes along with this that I'm interested in, because it's like, he's a failure in many ways. He's a failure. It's not his fault. And I mean, the ship gets wrecked and things like that. But with some people, we romanticize the failure. With like Robert Scott in the Antarctic, nobody cares about, what's his name, Amundsen, who actually made it to the South Pole.
What's his name?
Yeah, exactly. Everybody's fascinated by the guy who failed. Everybody is fascinated by the romance. There's a certain romance that also, though, can attach to failure then. Like not living up to that self-conception can be devastating. But then I suppose when you look at it from the outside, there's something romantic that's interesting to people sometimes. I feel like that's often the case. At least with the British, it seems to be the case. They seem to have a funny propensity to kind of fetishize failure sometimes. Like Lawrence of Arabia. Like you make this great movie with Peter O'Toole, he looks fantastic. And he's playing this guy who's a complete failure, actually. That's what's always so interesting to me about that movie, is you're like, nobody would make this 4-hour movie about a guy now with this great actor playing it, who was basically a guy who failed, who basically completely blew it in some ways. And it's really interesting to me. What is that romance of failure sometimes?
Yeah, the romance of failure. And I think I can't speak to all of it, but it's just a question. I think often the people we romanticize or the heroes we choose they're always the reflection of ourselves, right? We determine who do we want to elevate in our society. And that's, of course, why we see battles over who's being elevated and which statues, because they are mirrors. And I think people identify with romantic stoicism.
Also, I think there's some, there is this weird psychology where you don't feel particularly sympathetic towards who's in power, generally speaking, and sort of there's a general tendency to go for the underdog.
I have a lot of sympathy for the person who's stuck in charge for some reason. I mean, it just seems like, who the fuck? Nobody wants it. Nobody wants to be stuck in that.
Well, some people want it.
Some people do. Yes, some people do. Some people definitely do.
But, it is true, though. To me, failure as a writer is always more interesting in some ways than success.
Yeah.
It just is, because you learn more. Early in my days when I was more just a regular reporter and I had to get assignments and couldn't kind of figure out the weird stories I want to tell. When someone will come to me, if let's say it was even a sporting event, although this didn't quite exactly occur, but if someone told me at the World Series, you have to cover the winning locker room or the loser locker room, I'd much rather go to the loser locker room.
Interesting.
And this did happen to me where people said you can cover one or two campaigns. This was, I think, early in the New Yorker, and there was Obama and it was McCain. And at that point, when they asked me to do it, it was pretty clear that Obama was going to win. I said, I'll do McCain. Because we learned more about somebody who has quested their whole life, making compromises, Faustian bargains all the time, and you're so close and then it slips through. And I just think the pathos of that can be just so, as a writer, so much more revealing than the platitudes when we won. It's all great when you win.
Right.
Well, it's absolutely true from my point of view. It's much more interesting to play the kind of complicated guy who fucks up and fails.
You play a lot of those guys.
I do, but who struggles in some way more than the struggle's more interesting than somebody who, everything than the heroic figure. Although people like to look at the cool hero, I think people get more out of the other thing, watching somebody struggle more. Well, this has been extraordinary.
Yeah, this is really great Chinwag.
Thanks for showing up today, Steve, honestly. I really appreciate it. Thanks for showing up today, Steve.
I almost didn't, man. When I heard that
I never know.
We were going to talk about puppets and the top, I was like, I'm out.
I never know when I open my computer if you're actually going to show up. If this is the day when you're like, fuck this, I'm tired of this, I'm out.
No, I always love the Chinwag. Always.
Indeed.
Always a pleasure.
Indeed. And in just a few short days, we'll have a bonus wag for you. So be sure to check that out. And until then,
as usual, we should all wag on. Chinwag is a production of Treefort Media and Touchy Feely Films, hosted and executive produced by Paul Giamatti and Stephen Asma. Executive producers for Treefort are Kelly Garner and Lisa Ammerman. Dan Carey is executive producer for Touchy Feely. Our series producer is Rachel Whitley Bernstein. Original theme music by Luke Topp, with additional music by Via Mardot. Oscar Guido is our executive in charge of production. Tom Monahan is head of audio for Treefort. Audio production supervision by Jared Brom and Matt Dyson. Editing and mixing by Jeff Neal. Animation created by Alex Sokol. Research assistance by Aidan Brooks. Lastly, for more information, go to chinwagpod.fm and find us on Instagram or TikTok at chinwagpod or on Twitter at chinwag_pod.